On June 5, 2026, reports emerging from Kuwait City describe a situation that reflects the full breakdown of regional stability and diplomatic restraint across the Gulf. The imagery from Kuwait International Airport shows extensive disruption at the arrival facilities, with smoke rising from areas that include diplomatic compounds that were directly impacted. Authorities confirm one civilian death and dozens of injuries. Flight operations have been redirected to Terminal 4, while engineers and security teams assess whether the main terminal remains structurally safe. Kuwait's Prime Minister, Sheikh Ahmed Al Abdullah Al Sabah, was present at the airport inspecting the damage in person. The state news agency Kuna distributed photographs showing the aftermath, which quickly spread across major Arabic language outlets throughout the Gulf region. Iran's official explanation, delivered through Foreign Minister Arachi in remarks to Al Mayadeen, characterized the action as self-defense strikes. This claim was directed at Kuwait, a state that had spent years attempting to remain neutral during escalating regional tensions. Kuwait had maintained diplomatic channels with Tehran even as Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates shifted toward open confrontation. During the broader conflict period, Kuwait had endured repeated missile and drone attacks, yet continued to avoid direct alignment. By June 3, 2026, Kuwait had already been struck again. The airport sustained additional damage, causing disruption to civilian air traffic. Diplomatic facilities were also affected, with casualties and injuries reported. Iran again justified its actions as self-defense, despite Kuwait's continued neutral positioning and its efforts to maintain regional mediation roles. Kuwait's position within the conflict was repeatedly described as that of a balancing state, preserving communication with all sides while avoiding escalation. It maintained this approach even after absorbing repeated missile strikes and drone incursions, including incidents that caused civilian deaths and infrastructure damage. Despite these events, it continued diplomatic engagement rather than military escalation. Since February 28, 2026, Iran is reported to have launched over 4,000 projectiles against Gulf Cooperation Council states combined. Against the United Arab Emirates alone, by April 9th, the figure included 537 ballistic missiles, 2,256 drones, and 26 cruise missiles. UAE defense systems intercepted or absorbed these attacks. Reported casualties included 13 deaths and 224 injuries. Industrial infrastructure in Abu Dhabi sustained severe disruption, including damage estimated to require up to 1 year for recovery at a major aluminum facility in the Khalifa Economic Zone. Against Kuwait, air defense systems intercepted 97 ballistic missiles and 283 drones during the early phase of the conflict. 7 Kuwaiti soldiers were reported killed, with additional injuries among military personnel. Civilian infrastructure, including Kuwait International Airport and the Mina Al Hadi refinery, was also struck. A child died as a result of injuries from drone debris falling in a residential area. In Qatar, 203 missiles and 87 drones were launched. One incident involving a gas field dispute and subsequent retaliation resulted in estimated losses of $20 billion. Saudi Arabia faced at least 38 missile launches and 435 drones, with civilian casualties reported in the Al-Kharj governorate. Jordan experienced 204 combined missile and drone incidents. Oman reported strikes affecting ports including Salalah and Dakum, as well as Sohar and Buka. Bahrain was targeted with 45 missiles and 9 drones, with damage reported near facilities associated with the 5th Fleet headquarters in Manama. Although many of the more than 4,000 projectiles did not reach intended targets, the overall impact produced significant disruption across global energy markets, industrial supply chains, and financial systems. Earlier Iranian actions in 2019 and later strikes on United States military positions in 2025 are described as part of a continuing escalation pattern, but the current phase is characterized as both larger in scale and more direct, in targeting civilian and strategic infrastructure. Kuwait's role within this system was fundamentally distinct. It had functioned as a neutral intermediary, maintaining diplomatic contact with Iran, while other Gulf states moved toward confrontation and alignment with external partners. Kuwait continued to host communication channels and mediation efforts even under increasing pressure. Its neutrality was based on strategic calculation intended to preserve stability for a smaller state positioned between competing regional powers. Despite this posture, Kuwait experienced repeated missile interceptions, drone strikes, infrastructure damage, and civilian casualties. It also faced a reported infiltration incident on Bubiyan Island on May 1, 2026, during a ceasefire period. 6 individuals, identified as Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps personnel, attempted operations in an area where United States forces were believed to be present. A firefight followed in which 1 Kuwaiti soldier was wounded. 4 IRGC personnel were captured, while 2 escaped. Following these events, the June 3rd strike on Kuwait International Airport occurred, causing further casualties and damage. This included impacts on diplomatic missions and civilian infrastructure. Kuwait's response remained formally restrained, maintaining its diplomatic stance despite the cumulative incidents. Across the Gulf region, governments in Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, Doha, Manama, and Kuwait City issued coordinated statements of condemnation through the Arab League and the Gulf Cooperation Council. These statements marked an increasingly unified political position against Iranian military activity. The alignment included participation alongside the United States in joint declarations. Since the start of the conflict, regional governments have issued progressively stronger responses, forming a consolidated diplomatic front. This development represents a shift from earlier fragmented positions to a more unified regional stance. Kuwait's experience is presented as a central example of the broader strategic failure of neutrality as a protective policy. Despite sustained diplomatic engagement, it continued to be targeted through missile and drone strikes, infiltration attempts, and repeated infrastructure attacks. The events described demonstrate that neutrality did not prevent escalation. Kuwait's attempts to remain outside the conflict did not shield it from direct impact. The repeated targeting of its territory contributed to a broader regional conclusion that geographic position and strategic value outweighed diplomatic posture in determining exposure to attack. The Arab world's formal reaction to Iranian strikes demonstrates a major political shift. Prior to February 28th, Gulf state responses were limited to muted diplomatic criticism. Since then, the region has issued unified, escalating condemnations representing the most significant Middle East political realignment since the Abraham Accords, outside of Saudi Arabia and the UAE. Official rhetoric now differs markedly from responses during the 12-day Israel-Iran conflict in June 2025. 1 year ago, Gulf Cooperation Council governments criticized Israeli operations and the American strike on Iran's nuclear facilities, while attempting to maintain ties with Tehran. Today, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Jordan, and the UAE issued a joint statement with the United States condemning Iranian aggression and affirming the right of targeted states to defend themselves. The statement highlighted indiscriminate missile and drone attacks by Iran against sovereign states, describing them as dangerous escalation that violates sovereignty and threatens regional stability. Qatar, which had expressed regret over American strikes on Iranian nuclear sites in June 2025, now joins a coalition with Washington condemning Iran. Kuwait, once neutral, is aligned with the coalition shaped by Iranian targeting decisions. Saudi Arabia authorized covert operations against Iranian territory, confirmed through Reuters. The UAE conducted covert strikes on Iran's Levant Island oil refinery using Emirati Mirage jets, confirmed by the Wall Street Journal as the third direct combatant in the conflict. On March 30th, 2026, the Arab League convened a virtual meeting of Arab foreign ministers, chaired by Bahrain's foreign minister, and issued a formal condemnation. The Council denounced Iran's deliberate, unprovoked strikes on several Arab nations, warning that these attacks threaten regional stability and international security. Arab foreign ministers condemned strikes affecting Jordan, the UAE, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Oman, Qatar, Kuwait, and Iraq. They cited damage to residential areas, vital infrastructure, diplomatic missions, and hotels, labeling these actions as flagrant aggression against state sovereignty and a threat to civilians. Ministers affirmed the right of affected countries to defend themselves individually or collectively, expressing full solidarity with the targeted states. The Arab League's unified condemnation came after 47 years of navigating complex regional relationships without ever producing such formal alignment. Iran's targeting choices reveal the strategic self-destruction inherent in its campaign. Strikes against airports, electrical infrastructure, and residential buildings do not reflect a proportional military response to threats against its own forces. Instead, these targets indicate a strategy aimed at coercing civilian populations in states hosting American forces to pressure their governments to withdraw support for U.S. operations. The logic of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps was to impose political pressure by hitting civilian infrastructure in Gulf states hosting American forces. The execution backfired. Populations witnessing airport attacks, refinery strikes, and residential debris killing children did not demand a reduction in cooperation with Washington. They pressured their governments to respond to Iran. This civilian targeting, intended to fracture coalitions against Iran, had the opposite effect. It united Gulf populations against the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, consolidating the coalition the strikes were meant to dismantle. The UAE's experience illustrates this alignment. Since February 28th, it absorbed over 500 ballistic missiles, more than 2,000 drones, and over 20 cruise missiles. The Fujairah Petroleum Industrial Zone was struck, igniting a refinery and wounding 3 Indian nationals. The Emirates' global aluminium facility sustained severe damage, requiring a year for repairs. On March 19, 2026, the UAE Ministry of Foreign Affairs labeled the attacks as terrorist actions. Foreign Minister Sheikh Abdullah bin Zayed Al Nahyan declared the UAE would not be blackmailed by terrorists. Presidential advisor Anwar Gargash emphasized that a long-term security solution, not a temporary ceasefire, was needed. Covert UAE strikes on Iran's Levan Island refinery followed. The UAE exited OPEC, activated the Fujairah bypass pipeline at full capacity, shared IRGC-linked banking account details with U.S. authorities, and demanded a deal providing long-term regional security. Abu Dhabi entered the conflict aiming to hedge between Washington and Tehran. It emerges realigned toward the American-led coalition, structurally and institutionally rejecting Iranian influence, regardless of diplomatic developments. Saudi Arabia issued a statement supporting its neighbors, condemning Iranian aggression, and confirmed readiness to assist Abu Dhabi. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman called Emirati President Mohammed bin Zayed to reaffirm full solidarity and support. The timing of the June 3rd airport strike in Kuwait reflects the operational logic driving Iranian targeting. On June 2nd, the U.S. disabled a Botswana-flagged tanker heading to Kar Island using a Hellfire missile. Iran responded by striking U.S. bases in Kuwait and Bahrain and Kuwait International Airport, targeting vital and civilian infrastructure. The operational sequence was direct. The U.S. enforced the blockade, and Iran retaliated against Kuwait, inflicting civilian casualties in response to American action against Iranian economic interests. This behavior indicates that the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps treats Arab states hosting American forces as legitimate retaliation targets, irrespective of neutrality or civilian consequences. The Arab world witnessed Kuwait's airport struck for the third time, while the nation attempted to remain neutral. While Kuwait maintained diplomatic channels and absorbed 97 ballistic missiles along with hundreds of drones during a commando infiltration amid the ceasefire, it tried to stay neutral. The regional states have reached the same conclusion simultaneously. Neutrality is no longer available. There is alignment against Iran, or there is continued absorption of Iranian strikes on civilian infrastructure. 4,000 Iranian projectiles have reduced the choice to its simplest form. The Arab League statement, the Gulf Cooperation Council joint condemnation, and the unified Saudi, UAE, Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Jordan response with the United States reflect the binary decision the Arab world has collectively made. The Arab world's turn against Tehran represents not just a diplomatic realignment, but a strategic transformation with permanent structural consequences that will shape the Middle East for the next decade, regardless of the outcome of the current Iran-US conflict. Before February 28, 2026, the Gulf's security architecture relied on ambiguity. Gulf states balanced American security guarantees with economic relationships with Iran and China. The Abraham Accords were normalizing Arab-Israeli ties, but the broader GCC stance toward Tehran maintained enough ambiguity to prevent a formal coalition against Iranian influence. The launch of 4,000 Iranian projectiles against Arab civilian and military infrastructure since February 28th removed that ambiguity in weeks. The UAE, labeling Iranian attacks as terrorist acts and confirming covert military strikes against Iran, marks the end of ambiguity. Saudi Arabia authorizing covert strikes against Iranian territory and Iranian-backed militias in Iraq ends ambiguity. Kuwait, invoking Article 51 of the UN Charter and the Arab League, affirming the right of Arab states to defend themselves collectively against Iran, confirms the institutional end of ambiguity. The informal coalition Iran spent 47 years trying to prevent has now formed. Not through Washington's diplomacy, but because the IRGC assembled it by firing 4,000 missiles and drones at Arab civilian targets, killing children with drone debris, conducting commando infiltrations during ceasefires, and striking airports, all while calling it self-defense. The IRGC itself built the coalition that ends its regional influence. This realignment changes Iran's negotiating position. Arab states turning against Tehran affects every subsequent proposal through every mediation channel. The IRGC's strategy relied on Arab diplomatic passivity to generate pressure on Washington to accept a deal that preserves more of Iran's program than the American position would allow. Gulf state oil producers want open waterways. Governments want populations protected from ongoing missile strikes. Economies absorb conflict costs, creating domestic pressure for resolution. The IRGC calculated this pressure would push Arab states to encourage Washington to soften demands. The Arab League condemnation ended that ambiguity institutionally. The joint statement with the United States eliminated it diplomatically. Saudi and UAE covert military strikes eliminated it operationally. Arab states are pressing Washington to finish what it started and ensure a long-term security solution, rather than accept a temporary ceasefire. The UAE presidential advisor discouraged a ceasefire that does not achieve this. Saudi Arabia confirmed readiness to support any response to Iranian aggression. Arab pressure now reinforces American firmness instead of encouraging concessions. The June 3rd Kuwait airport strike is the latest example in a record building since February 28th. The IAEA incident response, the Arab League condemnation, the GCC joint statement, the UAE terrorist designation, Saudi covert strike confirmation, and the unified Kuwait, Bahrain, Qatar, Jordan, UAE, Saudi, U.S. statement have documented each stage. Gulf hostilities flared again as Iranian attacks damaged Kuwait's airport and injured dozens, while U.S. strikes near the Strait of Hormuz continued with little sign of diplomatic progress. Oil prices rose nearly 2% as the strait remains largely closed over 3 months after U.S. and Israeli strikes on Iran. Kuwait's airport closure and strikes on diplomatic missions, labeled self-defense by Iran, demonstrate that this conflict is not de-escalating. Ceasefire efforts show little effect. The Arab world that Iran counted on for diplomatic passivity has converted into a unified bloc, affirming the right to respond, authorizing covert strikes, labeling Iranian attacks terrorist acts, and demanding Washington produce long-term security solutions. The IRGC built its regional strategy, assuming Arab states would prefer accommodation over confrontation because the costs of confrontation were supposedly too high. 4,000 missiles and drones have shown that the costs of accommodation are greater. A child killed in a Kuwaiti residential area, a year of production lost at an Emirati aluminium facility, a Qatari gas field struck in retaliation for an Israeli operation, a Kuwaiti airport terminal closed by missile damage while Iranian commandos are interrogated. All demonstrate the costs of accommodation and confrontation simultaneously. The Arab world chose confrontation. The IRGC's strategy failed not because of American military power, but because its targeting decisions, intended to coerce Arab states into non-alignment, instead produced the most unified Arab institutional response in the history of the Islamic Republic. Iran fired 4,000 projectiles, and the Arab world responded diplomatically, institutionally, covertly, and in coordination with American military architecture. The Arab world turned against Tehran, not because Washington demanded it, but because the IRGC created the coalition against itself, one missile at a time. The June 3rd airport strike in Kuwait is the latest building block in this wall of isolation the IRGC constructed. The wall is nearly complete, and the IRGC built it. Please leave your thoughts about this content in the comments below. Thanks for watching. See you in the next one.